thank you all, friends, for coming today. It's astonishing to think that as we celebrate 150 years of this wonderful edifice, that a sixth of those have included the Frieze lectures. That's astonishing to me. I thought I was kind of well-aged when I started getting involved in these. What does that say about me now? We're very grateful that you're here. This is a wonderful way to get things started. Some of you may have noticed that we had a kind of a big celebration at Augustana over the weekend. And yeah, we celebrate presidents, but we celebrate other things as well. And it's known that we value longevity. Our presidents average about 20 years. But that's nothing compared to the English department at Augustana College. And that's even more surprising when you consider the first teachers of English at Augustana were hired as teachers of a foreign language to teach the students enough English to be able to get a job once they left the hallowed confines of Swedish America. And then you think about that department and its most illustrious figures, and I think first of Henriette C.K. Naiseth, who was not only a great professor of English, forget about a presidency for 20 years, she was chair of the English department for 34 years. Who would do that, I'd like to know. But she did, and she did it with great grace. And then we think of Dorothy Parkander, who was a professor for 49 years. And we think that's kind of interesting. And then we get to the guy who's about to be standing here. We gave up counting at 52 years. I don't even know what we would call it anymore, but old. But we're so grateful that Dr. Paul Olsen maintains his connection with our students and our colleagues and our campus, and as we see here today, our community. I'll let him tell you about the extraordinary author that he's going to talk about, but I will say that of my, I think it's been about 36 years at Augustana, I don't think anything was more special to me than having dinner with William Styron. How does a small liberal arts college out on the brink of Illinois manage to land William Styron? I think you're about to learn something about that, but it's all because of the extraordinary person I get to introduce to you right now, and that is Dr. Paul Olsen.
I got to eat with William Styron because about a year before that, my wife said, after hearing me talk about Sophie's Choice every night after school, why don't you write the guy a letter? And I did, and he responded right away. Everything he does, even Sophie's Choice, was written on 11-inch yellow paper by hand, never repeating anything. I said, did you put it up on the wall and chart the chronology of the stories? No, I had that in my head. Anyway, thanks to Jeannie, who said, write him before he dies. We did, we got him. He was a proud attender of everything at Augie the days he was here. He even came back again to speak at commencement. And Jeannie and I, Jeannie is my wife, got to go out to a big celebration of his life in Virginia. And then shortly after that, the friendship just kept going, lots of letters back and forth. And in 2006, he passed. And somebody said, did you know William Styron died today? And I said, I didn't know, but somehow I almost felt it. There was almost a friendship that developed over all these letters that made me realize that what a friend, but also maybe one of the greatest American writers ever. I had two notes before I start the close look at Sophie's Choice. And one is, I shared an office with a retired Catholic priest who had 3 PhDs in music, in English, and in Latin. And his line for teaching freshman English, I was probably at that time 35, and he was probably 85, and he said, this is what you tell your students. Look closely, tell the truth. And I'll talk about that through Styron's language, to look closely, to tell the truth, and to recognize that that's a scary thing to do. It's especially a scary thing to do right now in this, let's ban the books that don't please these parents or that parents or this group or that group. Sophie's Choice would, in lots of schools, would be banned. We know that there are people that resist talking about the Holocaust. We know that there are people, and we're going to hear 2 teachers coming up in the Frieze lectures coming up, that people want to ban the study of slavery. 1619 Project. So in the face of that, we have a writer who is courageous, is going to take on any subject that matters, and we'll know that he looks closely and tells the truth. And when he talks about, and when we talk about, and when we read Sophie's Choice, it isn't only the physical and the emotional stresses and sorrows that this woman lives with. It's a spiritual depth that lets us know the depth of this author and how far he goes into understanding, although he says it's impossible to understand, the Holocaust. In the middle of William Styron's, I was at a gathering last night and sat too far back and couldn't hear. So if you can't hear, boy, either stand up and shout. Are you okay?
Yeah, could you just move the microphone closer?
I'll do it. Now, thank you. I don't know how to do that. I'll move myself closer. How's that? Are we good? There. Okay. For those of you who maybe haven't read Sophie's Choice, it's simply the story of a woman who has survived Auschwitz. And that survival is, have to put in quotes. And what Styron looks at is not only does she lose people that she loves, she participates in mistakes that actually makes those losses happen. But most of all, I'll read the excerpt from the book when we talk about the theological and spiritual deaths that occur to victims of Auschwitz. In the middle of William Styron's novel, Sophie's Choice, Sophie and her lover have again had one of their boisterous fights, this one leading to their separation and departure. Stingo, who is the voice of Styron, and he's the narrator of the whole book, and he is both Stingo and Styron himself, of course. Stingo, closest friend to both Nathan and Sophie, and the novel's narrator, listens and responds to their neighbor Morris Fink describe what he calls all that fighting and screaming. Just to set that up, Morris Fink lives in the same place that Nathan and Sophie live, and Nathan and Sophie are fighting, and Fink now tells Stingo, through Styron's voice, what went on. I'm reading from the novel. They're gone, both of them. They finally cut out for good. He's still hollering at her about Auschwitz, mainly. Something like Auschwitz. About what? That's Stingo responding. About Auschwitz, that's what he says. Called her a dirty name again and asked her this weirdo question over and over. Asked her how come she lived through Auschwitz. What did he mean by that? Called her, what? I faltered helplessly, nearly bereft of speech. Then what? He said something about how happy he'd be never to have her, to see her again. I've never heard anyone cry like that. Sophie was crying then. Anyway, after she was gone, he left in the opposite direction. Gone then? I whispered, evilly stricken now. By this time, Stingo and Sophie and Nathan are dear, close friends. Gone for good, he replied. Sophie, I feel sorry for her. Sophie was a real nice broad, you know? For a moment, I could say nothing. The gentle Hayden, murmurous with longing, filled the abandoned room nearly with its sweet, symmetrical, pensive cadences, adding to my feeling of some absolute void and of irretrievable loss. Yes, I said finally, Mrs. Stingo. I know. What's Auschwitz? Said Morris Fink. Morris Fink doesn't know what Auschwitz is. Morris Fink, who I'm quoting again, who never heard anyone cry like that Sophie was crying, cannot comprehend those tears. These tears come not just because her lover left her, but because she has lost all her loved ones in unthinkable circumstances. These tears came from the very depths of Sophie's lost soul. Earlier, she has told Stingo about her childhood as a devout Catholic. After the Auschwitz concentration camp, she yearns for the God of her childhood prayers, yet she feels abandoned by God, and she tells Stingo. Lots of you people have been to the Augustana Christmas program with you hear the great stories of the Passover, the Christian and the whole thing with the Christmas. And she refers to, there's one piece of music that I cannot listen to. It makes me cry so much my nose stops up. I cannot breathe. My eyes run like streams. It is in these Handel records I got for Christmas. I know that my Redeemer liveth. It makes me cry because of all my guilt, and also because I know that my Redeemer don't live, and my body will be destroyed by worms, and my eyes will never, never again see God. Morris Fink cannot possibly comprehend Sophie's anguish. No wonder his account of this episode ends with, "What's Auschwitz?" And that's why William Styron writes. In an essay entitled Why I Wrote Sophie's Choice, Styron spells out explicitly his understanding of the role of an artist. And I've read this again and again and again, just as people are wanting to ban different books. And then I listen to this artist speak about why I wrote Sophie's Choice. If literature cannot change the world in a radical way, it can, all the same, penetrate deeply into human consciousness. Millions of people can read, and I believe that a book can work on their consciences. As a writer, I have no other goal. And the letters I receive are proof enough that I have succeeded. In October of 1990, William Styron received one of these letters that is proof enough from a reader in Poland. Dear Sir, this is not in the book, this is the letter to Styron about the book. I'm writing to you from Poland, country of Nicholas Copernicus, Friedrich Chopin, Marie Skolodowski-Curie, and after read Sophie's Choice, I'm sure that you must know Poland and our history very well. I'm 32 years old, geologist and paleontologist working in Silesian University, Faculty of Earth Science. In my private hobby, I'm literary lover, especially interested in American novel of 20th century. Among great other writer, you are my favorite. I've read and have in my private library all of your books. Some of them I've read not only once. In my mind, Sophie's Choice is one of the greatest novels in history of literature. I love it very much. I've seen film of Alan Pakula based on this novel, but I must say that in spite of great creation of Meryl Streep, this film was not very good in relation with your novel. After a lecture of this book, I'm not sure if you like Polish, but I hope that yes. My English is very bad and I can't express precisely all of my feelings. In Poland, you are a very well-known writer. Your books are very popular and hold very dear. Please come to us and convince that we are not very bad. If you would like to visit Poland, I could be your guide and organizer of your stay. I dream about some souvenir for you. Would like to ask you about your autograph and dedication writing by your hand. It will be a very precious souvenir for me and a really great honor. Please don't refuse my ask. It will be a sign of your well-thinking about Polish and great joy for me. Waiting for your answer, I wish you good health, all the best, and very, very much your faithful reader, Dionisi Novak. Styron has received countless intimate personal responses like this, and his best work has brought him acclamation and fame. But more importantly for Styron, his novels have, this is his quote, penetrated deeply into human consciousness. Lie Down in Darkness, his first big novel, earned the Prix de Rome, that's the award for the best American novel in Europe. And it showed how hollow relationships can destroy love and the very notion that love exists at all. For readers, the utter degradation of slavery and its ongoing legacy in American life, he has The Confessions of Nat Turner. It won the Pulitzer and clarified for readers this terrible degradation of slavery. Sophie's Choice has sold millions of copies, was made into a major motion picture, which Meryl Streep, as you know, won the Academy Award for the Best Actress, and that movie is currently a selection for a memorable, to be shown again and again and again. Sophie's Choice renders the complexity and subtlety of evil. And it works on our consciences by revealing our own complicity in evil. Whether by unconscious acts or by silence, we participate. Another book that follows, Darkness Visible, is a bold and honest autobiographical account of the anguish of depression, the illness that cannot be trivialized, that must be talked about, and not secretly inserted into a file marked confidential. Again, the courage of an author. It's his own. He has himself hospitalized twice because he knows he thinks he's going to commit suicide. Styron's understanding that his art can penetrate deeply into human consciousness and can work on their consciences is clearly demonstrated in all of his works. But not all of the reactions to Styron's work have been affirming and appreciative. In the hostile and contentious book, William Styron's Nat Turner, 10 Black Writers Respond, Styron and his The Confessions of Nat Turner. He wrote the story. He's a white man from the South writing about a black man who in 1832, August 21st, staged a rebellion and killed 64 people. The Confessions of Nat Turner is this bitterly condemned by black writers book, who use phrases like psychologically sick and morally senile. And they suggested that Styron possessed a vile racist imagination and that he, quote, missed the beauty of the African American idiom. Others said that he had created an indecisive and emasculate wimp rather than the stalwart figure of history, that the text reflected in approving views of the paternalism of slavery. And the secret agency of the entire work, The Confessions of Nat Turner, was to demonstrate how the black struggle for freedom was doomed to fail. Black novelist John Williams said, "I cannot say that Styron's book was honest. I have doubts that even in intent it was honest." And Williams adds that Styron failed here as a novelist to research the historical influences on his character. Another critic says that Styron is really trying to escape history. He's trying to escape the judgment of history embodied in Nat Turner and his spiritual sons of the 20th century. My own reading of The Confessions of Nat Turner, as well as the defense offered by Eugene D. Genovese, he is a preeminent historian of American slavery, and I think his devotion to the black cause would scarcely be questioned. He hastens to inject here that every single charge offered in the 10 Black Writers Respond that all criticize Styron can be challenged and disposed of, Most historians do that. But we remember, Styron still suffers from this blast from black people and black scholars. But not James Baldwin. Baldwin, the celebrated black novelist, playwright, and essayist, the essence of the controversy centers on the basic nature of Styron's Nat Turner, who is both historical and imagined. And imagined he was a victimizer or a victim. And clearly, in the novel, Nat Turner is a victim of what Styron viewed as, and listen to Styron's sense of slavery, an institution that was uniquely despotic, a closed system so powerful and totalitarian that organized insurrection was almost entirely precluded, though of course rebelliousness on an individual level was always present. He found one who rebelled, Nat Turner. And I read the book and I thought of my office partner. Look closely, tell the truth. My point in this essay is not to defend Styron's work. My point is rather to develop why and how he is willing to endure such vicious criticism. Surely he knows the risks that he takes as a white man, a Southerner at that, with no accurate historical reports to rely on when he tries to represent slavery, revolt, and a black man's consciousness and subconsciousness. But again, we hear the artist's goal to work on a reader's consciousness and to penetrate deeply into his human consciousness. It was, he says, my task to allow my imagination to range over these questions, questions about the absolute evil of slavery and the moral, religious, and intellectual complexities of life amidst this, a well-known phrase, peculiar institution. The story of Nat Turner has been gestating in Styron's mind ever since he was a boy, even before he knew he wanted to be a writer. I scarcely remember a time, he says, when I was not haunted by the idea of slavery or was not profoundly conscious of the strange bifurcated world of whiteness and blackness into which I was born and reared. Southern culture notwithstanding, Styron says, I was painfully sensitive to this disparity, just as I was conscious of the utter strangeness of this whole segregated world. The water fountains and the restrooms marked white and colored, the buses in which black folk were required to sit in the rear, the theaters with blacks seated in the balconies. In the larger towns, there were actually separate theaters. Even the ferry boats crossing the rivers and bays enforced a nautical apartheid, with white starboard and Negroes portside. I was perpetually bemused by this division and the ensuing isolation. It was a system both ludicrous and dreadful, and I sensed its wrongness early. He goes on to discuss his father's mother, who owned 2 slaves. She would describe the particulars of slavery, and in his own words, Styron says, nothing so awed me as the fact that this frail and garrulous woman, whom I beheld and who was my own flesh and blood, had been the legal owner of 2 other human beings. It may have determined more than anything else some as yet to be born resolve to write about slavery, to write about evil. All this says that intellectual and historical cultural curiosity, as well as righteous indignation, motivated Styron. But there is more. In an essay entitled Nat Turner Revisited, Styron quotes James Baldwin and issues a philosophical vision of humanity that guides his understanding as an artist. Each of us, helplessly and forever, contains the other, male and female, female and male, white and black and white. We are a part of each other. Aware of the risks he's taking, this artist embarks on a journey through history, with his only map being the disputable historical interview with Nat Turner, conducted by a white Southerner only days before Nat's scheduled hanging. Look closely, tell the truth. But Styron is also guided by his own artistic imagination and his passion for telling the complex truths about the evils of slavery through what Styron, in his own words, sees as a dramatic image for slavery's annihilating power, which crushed black and white alike, and in the end, the whole society. We know how he thinks, and next comes Sophie's choice. Styron's artistic vision and purpose are clear in the Confessions of Nat Turner, but also clear of the risks taken and the vicious criticism endured, given this experience of what Styron calls total alienation from black people, stung by their rage and finally cast as an enemy of the race. How does he dare then to go to Auschwitz? Styron is not Jewish. He is not a survivor himself. He writes fiction. Elie Wiesel has criticized, in general, all fictional responses to the Holocaust. And Styron quotes him in Sophie's Choice, speaking as the voice of the writer, Stingo. Novelists made free use of the Holocaust in their work, says Wiesel. In so doing, they cheapened it, drained it of its substance. The Holocaust was now a hot topic, fashionable, guaranteed to gain attention and to achieve instant success. George Steiner, and Stingo in Sophie's Choice quotes him, also remarks that it is not clear that those who are not themselves fully involved should touch upon these agonies unscathed. That silence might be the answer. That is, it's best in silence. Not to add the trivia of literary sociological debate to the unspeakable. The narrator, Stingo, voicing for Styron, says, when he's talked, this is in Sophie's Choice, and Stingo is talking about why he has to write this book. I cannot accept Steiner's suggestions that silence is the answer. Nor do I agree with the idea that, quote, in the presence of certain realities, art is trivial or impertinent. I find a touch of piety in this, especially inasmuch as Steiner himself has not remained silent. And surely, listen to what he looks at the Auschwitz, the Holocaust, and how he views it. Listen to his language. Almost cosmic in its incomprehensibility as it may appear, the embodiment of evil which Auschwitz has become remains impenetrable, only so long as we shrink from trying to penetrate it, however inadequate. And so he says, I must write. So Stingo, and it's Styron, writes about Auschwitz and simultaneously explores moral clarity, the redemptive qualities of love, and the pervasive presence and complicated subtlety of evil. Even though he calls himself an intruder, the writer intruding on the Holocaust, and even though his empathy for Sophie causes almost unbearable pain, Stingo's responsibility as an artist compels him to try to understand Auschwitz. Yet he knows that is really impossible. And Stingo puts down some statistics. In Poland alone, 85% of the 3.3 million Jews were murdered. I wrote this in there. This is not in Sophie's Choice. That would be like destroying every single person in the entire state of Iowa and then crossing the river to kill 30,000 more in Rock Island. That is evil on a scale that no one can ignore. No wonder Stingo later tells readers why he must write his story about Sophie. Someday I will write about Sophie's life and death, he says, and thereby help demonstrate how absolute evil is never extinguished from the world. Auschwitz itself remains inexplicable. But he does not shrink from trying to penetrate Auschwitz. But once again, Styron subjects his artistic vision to scathing criticism. No less a writer than the brilliant Cynthia Ozick chastises Styron for, quote, corrupting history by trying to displace Anne Frank as the emblem of the Holocaust suffering. Sophie, who is not Jewish, is to Ozick, I'm quoting her, a softly polemical device to distract us from the epitome. The epitome, the emblem of Holocaust suffering to Ozick, must be Jewish. The historical truth that Ozick expects in Holocaust literature is what she calls the purposeful embodiment of the innermost meaning of the camps. Styron does acknowledge that most victims of Auschwitz were Jewish, but Styron also understands that the innermost meaning of the camps, to use Ozick's phrase, is manifest in a larger, complicated varieties of evil. To Styron, the essence of the Holocaust experience is evil. No matter how the evil is rendered, it destroys the emotional, psychological, and spiritual essence of individual being. And remember, Sophie, I cannot listen to I know that my Redeemer lives, because I know that my Redeemer don't live. Evil annihilates the soul. Evil destroys beyond the skeletal human corpses the terror-stricken little boys with their caps askew and their hands in the air, the images that Ozick uses to accent the horror of the death camps. Styron would instead agree with Jean-Francois Steiner, who says that the real evil of the concentration camps creates, hear this, moral disarmament and total submission. And for Styron, evil knows no bounds. Early in the novel, readers meet the minor character Weasel. Stingo is working for Weasel. He's got this job to write reviews of books. And Weasel fires Stingo for not being like everyone else. Weasel reveals character traits that in more serious circumstances would label him a Nazi. A serious kind of evil is already at work, suggests Styron, in this go-to-work and just do my job employer who fires Stingo. We later learn this unconscious behavior is no different from the German civilians who turned their backs, no different from the millions of average citizens of Europe and America who, as Stingo says, drank beer and listened to Glenn Miller, while Auschwitz spewed gray smoke into the air. In Sophie's Choice, the evil of the Holocaust has no boundaries. That is not corrupting history. That is an historical truth that awakens Stingo to his own complicity in evil. That historical truth implicates all humankind in evil and demands a consciousness and responsibility incumbent upon every reader of this vital novel. Readers recall that Christians slaughtered Christians in the American Civil War. Native American Ojibways wiped out Sioux villages throughout the Midwest. Hutu killed Tutsis. The Balkan tragedy spoke for themselves. Evil thrives within, as well within religious, ethnic, and racial walls. The Capos were less than honorable in the concentration camps. I earlier quoted Styron saying, I have no other goal than to penetrate consciousness. Readers learn that Heinrich Himmler was a chicken farmer. We learn that Rudolf Hess was a homebody who almost became a Catholic priest, but who was also dedicated blindly to a duty in a cause, who thus became, as Styron states, a moral vacuum. Both have no conscience, and both deny consciousness. But Stingo's conscience is touched, and he cannot remain unconscious. I would suggest so too, readers. I have a note in my notes here that I've added. I've taught Sophie's Choice for 20 years. And every year in every class I teach, I ask for students to rate the books that they read, and if they get low rates, I'm not going to teach them. You can find good ones. Sophie's Choice, in probably 25 years, never received lower than 10. It was a 1 to 10 scale. Every single student. And listen to Styron's goal. Conscience is touched, and you cannot remain unconscious. The language conveying this rise to consciousness is precise, powerful. For Stingo, consciousness is a slow process, induced and influenced by his relationship with Sophie. For Sophie, her first awareness of what is really happening in Auschwitz is vulgar, abrupt, palpable. And she speaks about, "This was my first day in Auschwitz." But for the first time that day, the sweet, pestilential stench of flesh consumed by fire assailed her nostrils with the ripe bluntness of an avatar, so violently taking command of her senses that her eyes went out of focus in the throng of the distant platform, seeming for one last moment like some country festival viewed from afar, swam away from her vision. And involuntarily, with creeping horror and disgust, she raised her fingertips to her lips. Sophie is aware of the truth. On the other hand, Rudolf Hess, who commands Auschwitz, prefers not to think about it. He gazes out the window, watching a beautiful Arabian horse, and speaks from his heart. "I know how well I have performed my duty." He is silent for a while, and still watching the horse, he speaks again. "To escape the body of a man, yet still dwell in nature. To be that horse, to live within that horse, that would be freedom." Hess demonstrates a clear denial of human consciousness, and readers see and understand how he has been able to sink into unthinkable evil, unthinkingly. Stingo provides readers excerpts from interviews with captured SS officers. It's really Styron who does and has done the homework. He's read the SSI, the whole book of all kinds of quotes of SS men. They provide an anatomy of Hess's psyche that should be required reading. And Stingo says, "Throughout the world, by professors of philosophy, ministers of the gospel, rabbis, shamans, all historians, writers, politicians, and diplomats, liberationists of whatever sex and persuasion, lawyers, judges, penologists, stand-up comedians, film directors, journalists, in short, anyone concerned remotely with affecting the consciousness of his fellow man." Stingo's, and therefore Styron's, insistence on making these disclosures that he required reading is triggered by his desire to, as the artist says, penetrate deeply into human consciousness. Within these confessions, Stingo argues, it will be discovered that we really have no acquaintance with true evil. The evil portrayed in most novels and plays and movies is mediocre, if not spurious. A shoddy concoction generally made up of violence, neurotic terror, and melodrama. And so we read in K.L. Auschwitz, as seen by the SS, a book that Styron includes under Stingo's reading, about Hess's initiation of and participation into real evil. "I did not have the slightest idea of the mass extermination's scale or consequences. It was certainly an extraordinary and monstrous order. Nevertheless, the reasons behind the extermination program seemed to me right. I did not reflect on it at the time. I had been given an order and I had to carry it out. This is all in Stingo. Stingo has reported this to us in the novel. Whether this mass extermination of the Jews was necessary or not was something on which I could not allow myself to form an opinion, for I lacked the necessary breadth of view. This, to Styron, is real evil. This, to Styron, is the innermost meaning of the camps. Stingo argues that it's a liberal fallacy that equates the military mind with real evil and makes it the exclusive province of lieutenants or generals. The secondary evil of which the military is frequently capable is aggressive, romantic, melodramatic, thrilling, orgasmic. Real evil. The suffocating evil of Auschwitz. Gloomy, monotonous, barren, boring, was perpetrated almost exclusively by civilians. Beginning with the weasel, who fires Stingo from his job early in the novel, continuing with Morris Fink, who hasn't a clue what Auschwitz is, and ending with Joseph von Niemand, who drunkenly and haphazardly submits the unthinkable choice to Sophie. Unconsciousness is what perpetrates evil. Of course, and if you don't know, Joseph von Niemand is the soldier, German soldier who makes Sophie, if you haven't read it, I won't give it away, make a choice. At first, I'll back up. Of course, Stingo begins his journey unconscious, admitting that his spirit is landlocked, unacquainted with love and all but a stranger to death, he says. But, and he calls it, his voyage of discovery is meaningful and revealing. At first, he can't see past this is Stingo, his dull sex life and his paltry income. Nazi evil is a distant abstraction. However, Sophie is not an abstraction. She is beautiful, flesh and blood, and Stingo senses immediately that she has experienced something indescribable, something unthinkable. Initially, in his unconscious and uninformed naivety, he trivializes Sophie's despondency by simply aiming to raise her self-esteem. But also, even then, Stingo discerns something deeply disturbing as he contemplates, I'm quoting Stingo, how one mortal human being could be the vessel to contain such grief. Stingo contemplates Sophie's suffering and gradually becomes aware of his own naivety and the evil that Sophie has endured. He wonders, quoting the novel, what had old Stingo been up to while Sophie had been writhing in Warsaw's unspeakable Gehenna? He awakens with his realization that he was, quoting, listening to Glenn Miller, swilling beer, horsing around in bars, and he cries, God, what an iniquitous world. Through Sophie's apostasy and from her intimate accounts of her past before and during the war, Stingo comes to acknowledge human responsibility in the evil that created this iniquitous world manifest now in Auschwitz. He poses near the end of his account the question that Sophie repeatedly suggests. The query, I'm quoting the novel, at Auschwitz, tell me, where was God? And he is compelled to add another question. Where was man? Earlier, when he was, as he said at the beginning, unacquainted with love and all but a stranger to death, Stingo dismissed the guilt he felt about his mother's death with a flippant, fuck it, I thought, and began to think of sex. Similarly, he thinks, even after discerning Sophie's deep sorrow and hearing her full account of the horrors of Auschwitz, he can restore her, he thinks, by simply starting life over at his inherited peanut farm in Virginia. Of course, it is not to be. In the end, Sophie returns to Nathan, and both commit suicide, accompanied, evidently, first by the, quote, slow, sweet, tragic measures of Mozart, and last by, quoting, engulfing revelation that may have united them just before the darkness. Jesu, joy of man's desiring. Stingo now comprehends both Sophie's anguish and his own awakening. He drinks himself, Stingo does, into another world of hallucinations and goes to stand on the beach alone. Sophie and Nathan are dead. And here he contemplates his consciousness and examines his conscience. He recalls lines from his journal that he thinks worth preserving. First, someday I will understand Auschwitz. But he realizes this is absurd and more accurately imagines what he should have said. Someday, I will write about Sophie's life and death and thereby help demonstrate how absolute evil is never extinguished from the world. Auschwitz itself remains inexplicable. Second, he remembers his line, "Let your love flow out on all living things." He senses now in this new life the fragility of the words, and he contemplates Auschwitz. I have to interject here. Throughout the book, I stop myself and say, is there anybody who could write more beautifully? But listen to this part. Did not Auschwitz, he asks, effectively block the flow of that titanic love, like some fatal embolism in the bloodstream of mankind? Or alter the nature of love entirely, so as to reduce to absurdity the idea of loving an ant, or a salamander, or a viper, or a toad, or a tarantula, or a rabies virus, or even blessed and beautiful things, in a world which permitted the black edifice of Auschwitz to be built? I do not know. Perhaps it is too early to tell. At any rate, I have preserved those words as a reminder of some fragile yet perdurable hope. Stingo acknowledges his consciousness. He acknowledges what he calls the suffering Stingo whom I once inhabited, or who once inhabited me, learning at first hand and for the first time in his grown-up life about death and pain and loss and the appalling enigma of human existence. Now Stingo weeps. Not vaudeville and drunken tears, but tears which he had tried manfully to resist and could resist no longer. He weeps for the memory of Sophie and Nathan, but he also, quoting, lets go a rage and sorrow for the many others who during his voyage of discovery, during his rise to consciousness, quoting again, had battered at his mind and now demanded his mourning. These many others who, quote, were but a few of the beaten and butchered and betrayed and martyred children of the earth. We can't ban books. That's not in my essay. I'll continue with the last paragraph. William Styron says that his one goal as a writer is to penetrate deeply into human consciousness, to work on a reader's conscience. Sophie's choice intensifies the anguish suffered by all the victims of the Holocaust, while it also clarifies Stingo's voyage of discovery. Stingo's rise to consciousness changes his character and behavior from one who could not weep to a sympathetic and perceptive man who weeps unashamed. My last paragraph. As a teacher of this vital novel, I have long contended that Stingo is us, and that Stingo's voyage is our voyage. And if so, then William Styron would say that his art is worth the risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, friends, we have come right up to our time, but there is still coffee and some refreshments in the back, which would be great lubricant for conversations I know you'd like to have. I would simply say we want you to come back next week And that's when we'll hear our Professor Lauren Hammond speaking on the 1619 project. You've probably heard a lot about it in the news. Why don't you hear about it from somebody who's actually read it? Jane? On November 3rd, Cosmos, the work of Alexander von Humboldt, will be presented by Stephen Hager, a professor of biology at Augustana. And if you think that Origin of the Species changed things, wait till you hear about Cosmos. And then finally, our beloved colleague, Dr. Ashley Burge, will present on Beloved by Toni Morrison. I want to thank everybody at the library for everything you've done to make this series happen. But once again, could we please thank Professor Paul Olsen.